Good morning. Happy Wednesday. Welcome to Live with Liz. Today, we are kicking off a three-part series on the structure of legal services in law firms. Today, we're focused on defining those services. We're talking about practice areas and industries and departments. We're talking about what your firm does and who you're doing it for. And then on the next few episodes of Live with Liz, we'll focus on the competitiveness of your legal structure. We'll look at new law and how you fit into it. And we'll look at service models that are new, one in particular, subscription models. But today, we're really defining those services. We're talking about how to communicate them, how to be findable, and looking at some of the big mistakes that law firms commonly make across jurisdictions and in different practice areas. We see some things repeated over and over again. So this is absolutely critical to get right. This is foundational. It's how you're found by your clients and potential clients. And it's so important to what you're doing that it can really make the difference in whether or not you're successful as a law firm, whether you're able to grow as a law firm, and it can really just define everything about what you're doing and showcase your expertise and really just make you successful. So absolutely critical to get this done right from the get-go. I recommend evaluating your firm's services on a regular basis to see where you can make changes, and then really looking at growth opportunities. If you have to contract, that's also important. And then changes in the marketplace and how things are working competitively or not working. These are all things that you need to evaluate on at least an annual basis, if not a semi-annual basis. That's really recommended. There are some mistakes that I see across the board when it comes to communicating services and really trying to capture clients with the different things that you're offering. The mistakes I see most frequently are this tendency to be too broad. You want to cast the widest net possible. And as a lawyer or a law firm, you say, hey, I can do everything. I can be everything to everybody. You want to say, well, I provide these services, XYZ services, and really they're applicable to any industry anyway. So I can take clients from anywhere. I get the logic behind that, but no, you can't. There are some limitations, and you're selling yourself short when you do that. You understandably don't want to be pigeonholed, but specificity is really important when it comes to explaining what you do, and it's absolutely critical to being found. So that first thing that I see happening too frequently, where it's either a mistake or an area of improvement for a law firm, is trying to be too broad, being everything to everyone. Just doesn't work as effectively as being more specific does. And the next mistake that I see a lot of law firms making is that you tend to this doesn't happen as much in the United States as it does outside of the United States, but mix practice areas and industries as if they are the same thing. That to me is something that makes your communication unclear, and it's something that needs definition. It's something that really convolutes the services that you're offering and it just becomes confusing. So it's really important to define the services, what it is you're doing, and then look at those industries as who you're doing it for. And we'll get into more of that in a few minutes. But the last mistake that I think is super important to focus on is the fact that when firms have these issues of communication with their services and mixing up practice areas and industries or trying to be too broad, is that you really lose the ability to capitalize on your areas of expertise. So these are the three things that I see as areas of improvement for law firms. Again, the US has a lot of Am Law 200 firms, and many firms in the US have really already figured this out in terms of how to communicate what they do, but a lot of firms outside of the US haven't. And if the US is your target market for your potential clients, then it's really important that you get this right. So when I was in-house, I spent a lot of time looking for outside counsel. And when I would look for outside counsel, I would look very specifically for competencies with the offerings that they were providing. So for example, I might need franchise counsel in China, but I don't just want franchise counsel. I want franchise counsel who understands my industry. So instead of, for example, looking at corporate law, the corporate lawyers do franchise work as well. I would very specifically seek out a lawyer who had not just corporate law services, but franchise services, who understood the laws around franchising, and the franchise lawyers who were capable of doing work in my industry, whether it was hospitality or food and beverage. I would very specifically look for those things. This is not exclusive to my own experience. I've been with a lot of people who are in-house searching for outside counsel. We would get together at conferences and try and figure out best practices to understand how to find different attorneys. And even with really big corporations, I would sit there with other in-house professionals and say, well, who do you use here, and who do you use for this, and who do you use for that? And then also there are these industry conferences where you're looking for counsel who have very specific backgrounds. This is essential in oil and gas, for example, that has very specific regulations around it that not everyone just understands. So I'm not just looking for this generalist who can do everything. And that speaks to the first mistake that I was talking about, being too broad. When you are communicating what you do, you very specifically want to include your areas of expertise so that you can be found. And if you're just a generalist, you may just be overlooked by the potential clients seeking services. You might just not be found at all because you've cast that net so widely that, I'm just not going to give a chance to someone who might or might not be able to do it. There's a much greater possibility of me hiring someone who has that level of expertise in the industry that I'm looking for. Okay, so the second mistake that I mentioned was combining practice areas and industries. Now, there is not a one-stop solution for every law firm out there. Law firms are all different, and there are some cases where an industry may be seen as a practice area. And like I just mentioned, oil and gas, this is one of them. But in general, when I'm looking at practice areas, I'm looking at the services that you're providing as a law firm, not to whom you're providing them. So, I mean, are you doing corporate law? Are you doing intellectual property? Are you doing litigation? Are you doing licensing? Are you doing regulatory work? These are all practice areas, and within them, there are a lot of different services. Maybe you provide contract services, maybe you provide administrative law assistance, but you can really define these in terms of what it is you're doing. So when you look at a practice area, you think, what is it that we're doing? What are the services that we're providing? And you see which practice areas they fit into, you define them very clearly, and you can actually segment what you're doing that way. When you think about the practice areas, this is who you're doing that work for. So do you have expertise in litigation for oil and gas? So oil and gas might be one of the industries that you serve. Do you have expertise in food and beverage? Like I mentioned before, this has very specific sets of expectations, regulations around the world. Do you do anti-counterfeiting? Well, if I'm in the United States and I work for a big auto manufacturer and I'm having a problem with an import-export issue regarding cars, that's a different problem than if I'm in the pharmaceutical industry and having an import-export problem. I want someone who's dealt with the car guys before. So I'm going to very specifically look for automotive counsel, import-export, and whatever jurisdiction I'm looking to cover, that's how I'm going to search for outside counsel. So that's why it's so important to be very clear about what you're doing and who you're doing it for. And then really adding into your expertise, this, playing up your expertise is not something that's going to take away from what you're doing. It doesn't mean that you're too narrow when you include what you're good at doing, what you have experience in. It doesn't mean that you're necessarily excluding people from finding you, but it does mean that you have a possibility of being found by the people who are seeking your expertise. So it's true, I'm probably not going to hire the auto manufacturer to deal with my pharmaceutical issue, but that's okay. It's also okay if you have experience in both of those industries and want to highlight them. I mentioned departments too when I was putting this together, because in a lot of firms I've seen them use the term departments to reference practice areas. And sometimes those departments handle multiple things that sometimes go together and sometimes don't go together. And sometimes they are segmented in a way that makes sense or doesn't make sense. When you're communicating what it is you do and who you're doing it for, if you want to refer to a practice area as a department, that's okay, it's your prerogative, but it's better to say practice area. It's better not to use your internal structure for how you're handling these. So we're not talking about your workflows. We're not talking about how you provide the service from an internal perspective. We're talking about how you communicate your services to the outside. When you're doing these annual evaluations or sometime evaluation of your firm, it is also important to take a step back and consider, where would you like to grow? And think about all of the services you offer and whether or not they're included in what you're offering. Sometimes I will go into a firm and analyze the services that they have on their website. And I will say, well, do you do this type of work? Do you also do this type of work? I think about the things that are related to the services that they're already providing or on the periphery of those services. And I say, well, wait a second, you already have these competencies, but they're not listed on your website. So you may not even have to make changes to what you're doing necessarily to grow your business. You may be able to capitalize on what you already do just by rephrasing and reframing how you offer those services and say, okay, well, yeah, I have tons of experience doing administrative litigation in this area, in this area, in this area. Well, let's include it. And when we communicate what you're doing, be very specific about it and include it in there. And with the industry work that you're focused on, you don't have to be too narrow. And if there's an area that you want to go in, you'll hear me say more often than not, how do you become an expert in something? You write about it. So before you try and capture that client when you don't have the experience to service them, if you're really hell-bent on going into another industry and saying, I want to tackle this industry, I love what they're doing with this technology, I want to be a part of it, write about it. And go ahead and include that in what you're doing so that when people are trying to find you, they can see already that you have some of that experience out there. Now, there are some times when those industries have those very specific sets of regulations and you really want to treat them as a practice area. Now, on the corporate side, I don't love seeing industries treated as a practice area, but in some instances, it absolutely makes sense. So if you and your practice are fully dedicated to a specific industry, and this is the work that you do more than anything else, this is what you want to highlight more than anything else, that's when you make that jump and include an industry as a practice area. There are some people, for example, who only want to work in fashion law. Awesome. But, this is where you can capitalize on your expertise. You might say, okay, well, I have a practice area that's fashion law. When I'm sitting in corporate, I'm like, fashion law is an industry. Your services compared to that. I mean, I don't actually think that goes right over, but this is when I'm looking for clear communication, something that could jump out and say, okay, well, if I need a fashion lawyer, I'm coming to you because you have that expertise. It's clearly communicated and I get it. If I don't need a fashion lawyer and I'm looking for a lawyer who's just offering the same services you're offering in fashion, but in a different industry, I might skip over and go somewhere else because I want someone who can service another industry sector or who has experience in other areas. Oh, I just got this question from Modal Law. Let's see if I can show it here. Would you also recommend streaming about topics in 2021 or just from writing? That's a great question. Streaming is definitely the way to go. Not only streaming and including video communication, but every type of communication when you're doing this. Podcasts are really where I see the biggest growth right now is in audio. And so when you're communicating, definitely communicate through all of the channels that are available to you. This is super important, not just writing, but communicating in general. Great question, thank you. So if you need assistance in figuring out or just better defining what it is you're doing, and who you're doing it for. We have a lot of experience in setting up these legal structures and communicating them here at Firm Forward. And if you have questions about the rest of the series, about being competitive in your legal services, looking at new law, what the heck is that, and even those subscription models that I know are becoming quite the rage and trend right now, shoot us an email at solutions@firmforward.com. For all of you who want the event planner, as I mentioned last week, it is coming next week. It'll be ready, at least in some shape or form, and we'll get that to all of you who asked for it. And just a quick thanks to everyone who's reached out about my medical and health situation. I really appreciate all of your kind thoughts and words and support. So take care, everyone. I'll see you next week on Live with Liz.